3.2 Scientists investigated changes in the use of artificial fertilizer in India between 1970 and 2005. They also investigated changes in the fertilizer response ratio. This ratio shows how many kilograms of grain are produced for each kilogram of fertilizer used. And then figure 4 shows us how the data was presented. So our question asks us to use these data to calculate the difference in the mass of grain produced per hectare in 1970 compared with 2005. So there's quite a range that they're looking for. It's an answer that falls in the range of 90 to 133.2. You are allowed 1 mark if you have calculated either of the yields correctly, so the 1970 or the 2005 yield. So in order to work out this question, we need to go back to our graph. And we are going to look first of all at 1970. So if we start off looking at what our fertilizer response ratio is, we can go to our bar chart and we will read across to the axis that has the scale for our fertilizer response ratio, and we can see that that is approximately 12.25 or possibly 12.5. It's a bit tricky to see on the graph paper that we've got, but that's also why the range is so big. We can then have a look at the amount of artificial fertilizer that's used, and we're going to read off the opposite side of the graph to gain this information, and we can see that this is approximately 14. So now we're going to multiply the amount of fertilizer used, which we said was 14. We're going to multiply this by the ratio, the fertilizer ratio response, which was about 12.5, and that will give us our first amount, which is 175. We will then need to do the same thing but for 2005, so we can work out the fertilizer ratio response by reading across, and we can work out the amount of fertilizer used by reading across to the opposite axes. So if we take our values for 2005 and we base that on a fertilizer response ratio of approximately 3.8, and we multiply that by how much artificial fertilizer was used, which is approximately 76, that will give us an answer of 288.8 for 2005. So to work out the difference, it's the 288.8 minus 175 for the 1970 response. And in this situation, that gives us an answer of 113.8, which falls between their range. Obviously, this graph paper is quite tricky to read, so the range is fairly large, and you may have got a result that's outside of the range and your teacher has still awarded it due to the fact of when the paper's been photocopied, it is really hard to see. So that explains how we get an answer of between 90 and 133.2 for our mark scheme.